Hello, friends. We're going to investigate some of the counsel of our God in the Bible and the book of Exodus, chapter 2. We're going to consider the education of a very great man in the Bible, very well known from cover to cover. His name was Moses. In Exodus, chapter 2, here we're going to begin reading about the birth of Moses. I'd like to mention that Moses was born in a time of a great deal of affliction for his people. His family, his ancestors now had been in Egypt for some centuries, and it had been great at the beginning. But now a new king, a new Pharaoh, is in power, and God has increased the Israelites considerably. They have multiplied. They've had large families. They've had healthy men and women, mothers to raise the children. And as a result, their numbers were becoming much greater than those of the Egyptians. And the new king, the new Pharaoh, decided that something had to be done about it. His idea was to reduce the population of the Hebrews, of the Israelites that were growing there in the land to the north, there near the river Delta, of the mouth of the Nile River. And his remedy, as we discussed in our last study, was to basically murder the male children at birth uh, of the Hebrews. And it was first a commission to the the Egyptian midwives who helped the Hebrew women. And then it extended, when that failed, it extended to everybody. All the Egyptians were commanded to be responsible, and when they knew about the birth of a Hebrew boy, they were to cast him into the Nile River. Now, in this backdrop, we consider the birth of Moses. We're going to see him now. In this context, then, let us go ahead and begin reading in chapter 2 of Exodus in verse 1. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. So we have a Levite man marrying a Levite woman of the family, of the descendants of Levi, the son of Jacob. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when when she could not hide him any longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen. In expressing these thoughts, we understand why, when Moses was born, why his mother hid him for 3 months, because they were rounding up the baby boys and putting them to death. But then, a child gets bigger and stronger, and his cry carries farther. And when she was afraid that she could hide him no longer, then she took him to the river. She made him an ark. That was the same word that you have in Genesis chapter 6 of the ark that Moses was commanded by God to make to save his family from that generation. And God destroyed the world, and he was saved by an ark made of enormous dimensions, but sealed with pitch. This ark is a very small one, made of woven papyrus reeds, sealed again with pitch and with tar. And she placed him in the water, as the ark had been placed in the water of the flood, but in this case it's the water of the Nile, to save Moses, who then became the savior of his people, in the way in which Noah perhaps might be considered as the savior of humanity in the book of Genesis. So this is the situation, and She is the sister. Miriam, we learn her name is later. We're not told Moses' mother and father's names, but we know of them as being Amram and Jochebed. And so let's continue reading. We read, then Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the Nile, while her attendants walked along the bank of the Nile. Let me go ahead and put that up there for you to see. Noticing the basket of among the reeds, she sent her handmaid to fetch it. Opening it, she looked, and there was a baby boy crying, and we would assume that she heard the baby crying before she saw the ark. But there it was, one of the little Hebrew children that the Pharaoh, her father, was commanding to be put to death. Ironically, his own daughter, one of his own daughters, the pharaohs in Egypt, it's written in their writings, it's that they were given to had various different palaces in the land of Egypt, and there was a palace near the Nile, near the delta area, and each of those palaces, the pharaoh might have a different set of, or a different harem, a different set of wives and concubines, and then their children will be raised in those palaces. And so this perhaps was a palace there of Pharaoh and a daughter of Pharaoh being raised in that palace, not very far from the community of the Hebrew people. And so she goes down to the Nile to bathe, which was a very common practice among the Egyptians, and she discovers this baby boy crying. Now she hears him crying. Contrary to her father, who had no pity on the Hebrew children that were being murdered, she was moved with pity and said, it is one of the Hebrews' children. Mother female instincts kicked in there, and she heard the baby cry. Her heart reached out to the baby, and his sister was nearby, that is Moses' sister, and she asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and summon a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you? And that was a logical thing in the mind of Pharaoh's daughter. And she answered, go. And so the young woman went and called the child's own mother, Moses' mother, so was hired by the daughter of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's daughter said to him, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you wages. Imagine that. So the irony is that while her father is commanding the death, here now his daughter is paying a woman to take care of, to nurse, to save the life of one of these Hebrew boys. And so the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew, we'll assume that she nursed him for a couple of years at least, maybe 4. In some cases more. The idea of nursing a child in the Hebrew language could encompass the whole upbringing of the child all the way to maturity. We don't know how old he was, but at some point, we're told she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she became, or he became, her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, I drew him out of the river. Now, that would be terminology characteristically Hebrew. The Hebrew and the Egyptian language, I suppose, had a number of words in common, certainly with the two cultures being thrown together for 400 years or however long it was. There would be, the Egyptians commonly borrowed words not just from the Semites, but from faraway lands in Babylon and Hittites and Sumerians. And so in this case, the name in Egyptian would be a fairly common name, such as a beloved or a child, a beloved child, as many of the pharaohs had the name Moses in their name for that reason. But the word also sounded a great deal like a Hebrew word which would indicate drawing out of the water. And so, with that sound in common, with the play on the sound of the words, Moses became an Egyptian name as well as one that had perhaps hidden Hebrew significance throughout the history of the Israelite nation. Reading on further, we're told as a man now growing up in the courts of Pharaoh, and very likely in that same palace, not very far from his own people in the land of Goshen. We read in verse 11, on one occasion, after Moses had grown up, we're going to assume he's educated in the palace. He learns the language of the Egyptians, the culture, and the royal children were mostly they were trained to become administrators, to help in the government, to be a part of the bureaucracy that governed the land of Egypt. So, in that capacity, you see him surveying the building projects and the way in which the taskmasters were treating the Hebrew slaves. And so we're told when he had gone out to his kinsmen and witnessed their forced labor, he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his own kinsmen. The word striking there could mean whipping him, or actually the word also could mean killing him. And so, knowing his roots, Moses rises to defend his countrymen. Looking about and seeing no one, he's cautious. He struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So Moses was no wimp. He was a man with courage and with physical strength, and intervened and struck down the Egyptian who was beating the Israelite. The next day he went out again, and now two Hebrews were fighting. So he asked him, the culprit, "Why are you striking your companion?" Now, this is a case where one Hebrew is striking another. But he replied, "Who has appointed you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptians?" Now, Moses thought he had done this without anybody seeing him. Obviously, somebody saw him, or they were talking about it among the Israelites. Then Moses became afraid and thought, the affair must certainly be known. When Pharaoh heard of the affair, so it was known. Pharaoh heard. When Pharaoh heard of the affair, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to the land of Midian, where he sat down on a well. So now we've come to a point in Moses' life where he's grown up there in Egypt. He's a 40-year-old man. He has tried to rescue an Israelite, but it's become known that he's taken sides. He has shown mercy rather than supporting an Egyptian. His true affections are being identified with the slave race. Pharaoh wants him killed, so he flees. He flees to the land of Midian. He had to cross the Sinai Desert to get there. We know that the Midians were already, they were descendants of Abraham, and generally they were enemies to the Israelite peoples later on. But here among them, here a priest of the Midianites is the one that we have Moses joining himself to. This land was in northwestern Arabia, just a little bit south of Edom. Now we have these details from various places in the Bible. We know more or less this area where Moses is at a well and resting as he has fled from that region. The Sinai Desert was a part of the Egyptian Empire, so he couldn't stop there. He had to cross the Arabah there south of Edom and enter into that land there of the Midianites. And so we read now, moving on down, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Commonly in these desert regions, wells were precious and they were covered, even as Jacob had uncovered a well to water the flocks of his future father-in-law. So in this case, though, shepherds had come. Their shepherds are watering their flocks from the well water. And the daughters of the priest are there, and the shepherds have driven them away. So Moses rose up in their defense, even as he had tried to defend valiantly the Israelite slave. Now he defends these 7 daughters of the priest of Midian. When they returned to their father, Reuel, we know his name here, later he's called Jethro, he said to them, "How is it you have returned so soon?" They answered, "An Egyptian delivered us from the shepherds." Now, this lets us know that Moses dresses or speaks in some way that has identified him in the eyes of the Midianite girls as Egyptian. So they just say, "An Egyptian delivered us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "Where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave the man there? Invite him to have something to eat." Now, Reuel has seen this man as someone that they need to extend a protection, or at the very least hospitality and gratitude for his defense of his daughters. And so he continues, he is content to dwell there and enjoy the security of this man. In verse 21, Moses agreed to stay with him, and the man gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. This becomes significant because of the importance of Moses. His wife Zipporah gives him 2 sons, and we know of them more as time develops. But Gershom was his first one, and we read, "She conceived and bore a son, whom he named Gershom, for he said, I am a stranger residing in a foreign land." Now, the word Gershom in Hebrew had the sound of a sojourner. So this is how Moses regards himself. He's in the land of Midian. He was born and raised in Egypt. Where is home for Moses? He's a man without a home. He's a sojourner in much the same way that his ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been sojourners in the land of Canaan. And so we have a few verses left in chapter 2, but it begins another section because there in the desert, something begins to happen where after the next 40 years of Moses taking care of the sheep of his father-in-law, meanwhile, back in Egypt, Israel continues to be oppressed. 40 years more of suffering. Verse 23, "A long time passed during which the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their bondage and cried out. And from their bondage, their cry for help went up to God. God heard their moaning, and God was mindful of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew." This language of God knowing and God seeing and God hearing becomes dramatized in the next chapter as well. At this point, we are reminded that all afflicted, when they cry out to their Creator, God hears them. God is a merciful God. God has always been a merciful God. And even if people are being afflicted by God's own people, God hears that. God does not want his people to afflict others. That's never been God's way. And we are warned that how God treats us will depend a great deal on how we treat others. In this case, though, we're told that they cried out from their bondage. Their cry went up to God. We can just hear, as in the book of Revelation, when in chapter 6, you had the souls under the altar, the blood of these martyrs poured out at the blood of the altar of God symbolically, and their innocent blood cries out to God, even as God had told Cain that the blood of innocent Abel that Cain had shed, that blood cried out to God for vengeance. So God heard their moaning, we're told. But in this case, those who were moaning were a special people. They were descendants of Abraham. God had sworn an oath in Genesis, back in chapters 12 and the following chapters. God repeatedly had promised Abraham and finally had sworn an oath that he was going to give them the land of Canaan, that they'd become a numerous and powerful and blessed nation, and that through their descendants, God would bless all the nations of the earth. Now, that promise of God would not be changed and would not be forgotten. God does not forget his promises. He's not like man. God cannot lie. God cannot break his word. And so we're reminded of this covenant that God had made with Abraham. And God saw Israel. And God knew, as in the book of Revelation, when the early church was being persecuted, they needed to know that God in heaven saw them and that he knew what they were going through and that he was going to do something about it. And in this case, we begin to see how God was going to do something about the sufferings of his people who were slaves in Egypt. And so we pick up then in chapter 3 in this study. It's been good to share this time with you. I appreciate your audience. May God bless you.